Tony Ferguson is set to make his boxing debut against Salt Papi, fighting on the next Misfits Boxing card as the co-main event right under Darren Till versus Luke Rockhold. And with Tony Ferguson being on an extreme decline recently, many are concerned for how he's going to do in this fight. So this is why Tony Ferguson versus Salt Papi will not end well.
But before we get into that, we're Punch Talk going to bring you banger combat sports videos. So if you enjoy the content, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to help support the channel. So Tony Ferguson is back, not in the cage, not in the octagon, not even in the GFL like was announced. He was going to be fighting Dylan Dennis. Instead, in August, he's going to be taking on the Filipino phenom himself, Salt Papi, who's a big name influencer boxer, a guy that has been getting a lot of highlight reel knockouts over the years. And it's not like he has some phenomenal resume, but he's been training boxing. He's been doing boxing for a while. Even when he started making a name for himself, there were rumors that he had a huge amateur boxing pedigree and that he was way more experienced than he actually was, even though it doesn't seem like that was really the case. Regardless, Salt Papi is clean. He's way younger than Tony Ferguson. Salt Papi has boxing experience, has had boxing fights, and going up against a guy in Tony Ferguson, who, if we're going to be brutally honest, has been not looking great at all in MMA, in the UFC, in his own sport. And granted, that is the UFC, that is the greatest MMA organization in the world, but it's not like he was just losing to the cream of the crop. At first, he was losing to guys like Justin Gaethje, Charles Oliveira, but then as time went on, he started losing to Nate Diaz, getting submitted by Bobby Green, Michael Chiesa, and it's not like his boxing has even been his biggest strength. So if I'm going to be honest, I'm very worried for Tony Ferguson to even be fighting at all, and I'm not going to sugarcoat things. I think Salt Papi's probably going to knock him out. He's coming off a nice knockout over another YouTuber, King Kenny, who's had a lot of fights, who's had a lot of boxing experience. Tony Ferguson, while he has a lot of combat sports experience and fighting experience, we've seen how a lot of these go when you get an older MMA guy going up against an influencer who's been training boxing, who's been dedicated to the sport. I feel like Salt Papi's going to clean his clock, and it's probably going to be pretty sad to see.
Yeah, it definitely will be, and it's not like Salt Papi is the greatest boxer in the world, but like you said, he's been taking this serious for a couple years now, and even though it is fights against not great competition, we've seen him do great things in the ring, getting some really good technical knockouts against the likes of Josh Bruckner, against King Kenny, and those are shots that he landed that were actually with good technique, good power, everything you want to see in someone that's taking boxing serious. And Tony Ferguson just doesn't have those qualities. Maybe if he was in his prime, he could try to utilize his insane cardio and just make it rough, make it dirty in the ring, and try to rough up Salt Papi, kind of like what Anthony Taylor did in their fight. He just clinched him a lot, made it rough, made it dirty, and ended up winning that fight. Was giving Salt Papi his very first loss in his career, ending the hype pretty much. But at this point in Tony Ferguson's career, it just seems unlikely like he'll be able to do that. He's gotten knocked out already brutally by Michael Chandler with that front kick. Of course that's a kick, of course that's MMA, but I can just not see how this will end well, especially with how much Tony gets hit. We pretty much saw in that Justin Gaethje fight, it was more a boxing fight than even really a kickboxing fight. They were just throwing hands, and although Tony had some very small successes, for example that uppercut that hurt Justin badly at the end of that round, overall he was getting pieced up badly, and boxing alone is just not the strength that he possesses. Overall, it's just a bad look, and of course it's going to be a great payday for him, considering that he probably can't get any more fights in the UFC, and he would have fought in that new GFL league that goes down. So another opportunity here for him, and in a way it kind of seemed like it was bound to happen eventually. He had previously said that he was looking at Tony Ferguson as a potential opponent coming off the Tommy Fury fight, him alongside some other older kind of washed up MMA fighters like a Donald Cerrone. Tony Ferguson was one of those names, so it kind of seemed likely eventually that would happen. We're seeing some of these older UFC guys coming into Misfits Boxing like Darren Till on the main event, so if he could win this fight, maybe it could put together some more fights for him to get some more paydays on Misfits. But overall, it just seems very unlikely that Tony Ferguson can get this one done.
Yeah, it's not like Salt Papi's this invincible guy. He's even been stopped a couple years ago against Slim, who's another YouTube boxer who has a similar experience to him, similar age to him. And like you said, Tony Ferguson has had his moments over the years, like you said in that Gaethje fight, dropping Michael Chandler in that first round, having success there, even against Paddy Pimblett a little bit. But he's tried everything. He's even tried bringing in David Goggins into his corner to push him to carry the boats, and clearly it hasn't been working. He hasn't been winning. He hasn't won a fight since 2019. It's an 8-fight losing streak in the UFC, in MMA, and now moving into a completely different sport where he's even more limited than before. He doesn't have all his tools at his disposal. Obviously, if this was an MMA fight, we're talking about a completely different thing. If we're talking about even a fight against Dylan Dennis in MMA, maybe that could have been different. But in pure boxing, Tony Ferguson has not ever had a pure boxing fight in his life. And while Salt Papi has lost here and there, you could just tell by watching them fight based off the eye test, hitting the pads in the ring. Salt Papi's patience, his accuracy, his timing, his power, his reflexes, his speed, all seem to be at least a little bit better than Tony Ferguson's, especially at this age, especially because this is nowhere near prime Tony Ferguson. It's not like he's a little bit washed. It's not like he's lost some fights here and there. No, we're talking 8 fights in a row. We're talking getting beat and finished like 5 times in the last 5 years. Now, granted, not all of them were brutal finishes and brutal knockouts, but he's only going to be boxing with a guy that's probably way more powerful than him, has more snap, has more experience in the pure boxing ring, and is just way younger and actually in his prime. I don't know how Tony does get it done, but if he were to, it would have to be just drowning Salt Papi, using that experience, using that veteranship and craftiness to try to wear him down over the rounds. We don't know how long this fight's going to be, how many rounds it could be. That's a potential hole in Salt Papi's game, going the distance, going more rounds. We saw him gas out against Slim and getting stopped in that 4th round. We saw him against Anthony Taylor just kind of lose to the guy who was a little bit more experienced, knew a little bit more how to win. So if Salt Papi gets dragged into a dogfight and into those deeper waters, maybe Tony can pull it off, and that's really his only chance in my opinion. I don't see him pulling off some knockout out of nowhere or being able to just outbox Salt Papi tit for tat. I just cannot see it at this age, at this point in Tony Ferguson's career. He's on an 8-fight losing streak and 41 years old now. Hopefully he does well. Hopefully he doesn't go out too badly, but honestly, I don't think it's going to go that well. I think he probably will get put out, knocked down in some fashion, whether it's a TKO, whether he's out cold. We've seen so many of these fights at this point, and it's just hard to not pick Salt Papi to beat Tony Ferguson, even though as much as I would like Tony Ferguson to get back to his winning ways, and no one wants to see Tony keep on losing, I just don't think this is going to be the fight where he's going to win.
Yeah, and in general, really, you could just sum it up by saying Salt Papi is in his prime and Tony Ferguson is far away from it. And I would think he would for sure would have learned from that Anthony Taylor defeat, fighting against that scrappy clinch style in which Taylor was making it as rough as possible, not clean at all, not giving Papi any distance at all to find his shots, get his rhythm going. So even if Tony would have that sort of game plan, you would think that Salt Papi would have grown and would have maybe learned to fight against that certain type of style, especially for this upcoming fight. But Tony just gets hit way too much, and honestly, it just seems like he'll get hurt very badly in this fight, unfortunately. And it's just tough to see legends go down like this. In some way, it's good that he can get that paycheck even when he's done with the UFC. There are other avenues for him still, but is that really worth all the damage he's receiving? This many losses in a row, this much brain damage he's getting? It's hard to say, but maybe if Salt Papi gets a big win, this can kind of catapult his name a little bit more once again, because prior to that Anthony Taylor fight, he had so much hype. Even more boxing purists and even Eddie Hearn was saying he looks more like a proper boxer. He could maybe actually be a boxer. Of course, he took his first loss and then the hype kind of died down, but Salt Papi has always had that potential and really has been the only guy from Misfits to have that wider appeal. So who knows, maybe this can be a huge moment for Papi, but unfortunately that would be at the loss of Tony Ferguson. But let us know down below who you think is winning this upcoming fight between Salt Papi and Tony Ferguson. And if you want to check out more combat sports on the channel, be sure to check out We Need to Talk about Tyson Fury.